nobody on a local level really has dug into it. And that's where I found the opportunity. Okay, nobody's talking about this, but it's a problem that within the industry people know about, but nobody's talking about it. Somebody should be. I guess I'll do it.
Welcome to episode 460 of the Community Broadband Bits podcast. This is Ryan Marcatilio McCracken here at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Today, Christopher talks with Nate Benson, a reporter with WGRZ in Buffalo, New York, along with ILSR senior reporter and editor Sean Gonsalves. Nate joins us to talk about all of the broadband reporting he's done on connectivity issues in the western part of the state over the last 2.5 years. He shares the origins and results of his fall 2019 investigation into monopoly service and what the lack of competition has done to prices and availability in the city, and how he approaches producing stories on internet access that have resonated with citizens and galvanized local policymakers in the community. Christopher and Sean also talk with Nate about his continuing coverage of issues like the charter merger and its consequences, the company's lobbying power in the state, and an ongoing audit of the state's broadband grant program. Now here's Christopher and Sean talking with Nate.
Welcome to another episode of the Community Broadband Bits podcast. I'm Christopher Mitchell at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in St. Paul, Minnesota. And today I'm speaking with Nate Benson, a journalist with WGRZ in Buffalo. Welcome to the show.
Christopher, it's great to be here. And, as a fan of the show, you will not need to lecture me on the subscribers versus users argument. So I'm already prepared.
You have no idea how happy I'm to hear this. I go months without people noticing that. And today I've received 2 comments from people who have noticed the importance of talking about subscribers versus consumers. So very appreciative.
Try to be prepared.
We also have Sean Gonsalves, a person who I brought onto my staff from a reporting background, who is rapidly rising through the ranks and is probably going to take over this show at some point. I'm just looking at the expression on his face. I'm like, no, I don't want to do that.
I'm hungry.
Sean, welcome back.
Thank you.
So we're going to start off by talking about kind of why we brought you on, Nate, which is that you're doing really good reporting on broadband, and we don't often see that from local news stations, which is not to say that that I'm trying to insult any local news stations. It's just that this is a hard topic, and often it's not something that gets a lot of coverage. And so I want to start off by asking you, did you get bit by the broadband bug? What made you really want to lean into this reporting on these stories so frequently?
Well, I appreciate the comments regarding the reporting we've been doing. And, to answer your question, I got to go back into my background a little bit. So I got into the TV business in 2010, joined a news station in 2013, worked there at WGRZ between 2013 and 2017. Then made a change, went to marketing. Full disclosure, I did not like the dark side, as we call it. Marketing was not my forte. Too many meetings. In news, you got to power through the day, and that 4:00 deadline comes on, and you got to get on the air. So I had an opportunity to come back at WGRZ in August of 2019. And one of my first conversations with my news director, Athen Compost, was I keep getting emails about internet access, and I don't know how to answer them. So you figure it out. I said, okay, great. And I had done my previous stint at Channel 2. I had done a segment called Innovate Western New York, where I talked with startups, research at University of Buffalo, and just kind of innovation type things. So I'm always the de facto tech guy. Whenever there's a tech story in our region, they always assign it to me. And that still continues to this day. So this was kind of in the wheelhouse of technology. And, when my news director asked me that, I just kind of started digging in and looked at the city of Buffalo. We only had one carrier. The second biggest city in the entire state, and we just had Spectrum. Why was that? So then you're going back and looking at, 2-3 decades worth of franchise agreements and figuring out where the complexities of that were. And, our first report on kind of a broadband related issue was about why is there one carrier in the city of Buffalo? And that reporting in October of 2019 led to the city council changing their policies. And by December, it was announced a new fiber carrier was coming to Buffalo. And, I'm not patting myself on the back, but, nobody had done an extensive report on that issue about Buffalo's issues before. And all of a sudden we started doing it, and then policies changed. Okay, great. That's a great win. But it didn't stop there, because simultaneously I was looking at the New York State broadband program. I was looking at access issues in Niagara, Orleans counties, the southern tier counties, which are very rural. I mean, Western New York is very unique because, we're about the size of Massachusetts, and we've got everything from cities to very rural, low density populations living throughout our viewing area. And then as I dug into these stories, it's kind of like the movie at the end of the movie Chinatown. Forget it, Nate. It's broadband, and I kind of get more and more as I peel the onion. It just becomes more complex and fascinating. And yeah, I guess you could say I did get bit by the broadband bug, and now they pretty much know I'm going to pitch a broadband or digital gap story whenever I bring up a pitch, and they just say just go do it, and don't bother wasting our time with the pitch because we know what you're working on.
Nate, it's interesting to hear your background. I can relate, having come from print journalism and then went to the dark side, as folks in the newsroom call it, for a few years, and then when this opportunity come up to get back to reporting, it was great. So I can really relate. It's also very fascinating to hear you talk about kind of the emails that you got, and that kind of providing sort of an entree into reporting on this topic. And I noticed in one of your recent stories that you're talking about kind of the challenges of reporting on broadband. It took you 2 years to get an interview from an official with the New York State Broadband Program Office. And I am dying to hear the behind the scenes kind of back and forth that you might have gone through, and to hear, obviously why you think they were so reluctant. I have an idea, but I'd love to hear you talk about that.
As I started looking into broadband, obviously, Governor Cuomo had a very ambitious program that he announced in 2015, which was the Broadband for All program. And, at the time in 2015, I actually went to Albany. I convinced my boss at the time to let me go. And I talked to David Sellaway, who at the time was the director of that program. He has now since moved on to a different administration. And I believe Jeffrey Nordhaus took over the broadband office, and now Scott Rasmussen is in charge of it. So they've had several leaders turn over. Really, the issue was, I just started asking questions, and nobody had looked into the program before. I think everybody kind of forgot that, the project was scheduled to be completed by the end of 2018. At the time I started asking questions, it was October of 2019. So they were at that time less than a year overdue. They were reluctant to. It's interesting because, again, nobody was really asking the question. So I think they weren't prepared for somebody to be talking about digging into the data. And, to the state's credit, they published a lot of the data, how many passings that they claimed to have connected, all the money that they, had pledged, and what the total investments were for everything. We're talking about over $500 million. But when you look at the data, the story really started to unfold. And the biggest thing that still remains a mystery to me was, even though only $15 million of the money allocated for the project went to satellite providers, about 30% of the people connected were connected to satellite. And that still stands out to me to this day that, a program that was designed to bring broadband 100 megs to everybody, 30% of the program only got satellite, which the state continues to claim can provide the minimum of 25. I think anybody in the industry who's talked to anyone who uses satellite knows that 25 would be a godsend for any satellite user. And it's not the reality.
There's a joke, or sort of like a statement people have attributed to Netflix over the years and different things, but over a certain time frame, I can deliver 25.3 by a truck. I just put a bunch of hard drives in a truck and drive it around, and on average, I'm delivering 25 megabits a second. If I get that truck to you every other day or something like that, with just zettabytes of data, right? I mean, this 25.3 fixation does not describe broadband. This is clearly not good enough.
And I think anyone who follows it knows that that's going to be changed. And the pandemic has certainly, played into that as well. But going back and, I asked for an interview at the spring of 2019. I said, listen, I think, you've made some claims, and, but me talking to the boots on the ground, so to speak, people who you've said you've connected, tell me otherwise. So, they didn't, they wanted to provide statements, and the statements were always 98% of the states connected. And, it's first in the nation, and, touting Governor Cuomo, the state broadband office is not a, it's a government office, but it's within a corporation called Empire State Development. Empire State Development controls a lot of projects across the state. And it's a way for essentially the governor's office to control what the project is doing, what information gets out. And it's a developmental tool. In a lot of states, not just New York, have similar type programs, but, ESD, as we call it, is the tightly controlled entity within Governor Cuomo's administration. So it's not run like a public service commission or a Department of Transportation where, you've got set leaders and people were kind of appointed. And, the state forgot that I went and talked to David Selway at the beginning of this. And, they made a lot of promises. And at the time when they announced the program, I mean, the broadband definition, I believe, was 10 megs. I mean, it was not, they changed it, I believe, in 2016 or 17, to 25.3. So
I think it was 2015, but yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, within the time, it was within the time of the program being announced, the kind of the yardsticks moved, so to speak. So I was just persistent. I said, we need to hear from somebody. Statements are not going to cut it, and we do the same thing with any type of politician. The job of a journalist is to hold people accountable, and it's not necessarily to negatively hold them accountable, but we have to verify the claims that are made, and especially the claim that 98% of the state has broadband. It's if you know the industry, and I'm not saying I'm an expert, but if you just read enough about the industry, that that's a very high mark to try to hit. And one state senator continuously tells me if the governor's claim is true, then all 2% live in my district because we're very negatively impacted. So, it took persistence, and there was some changeover with the public information officer for the office. I heard secondhand, so I can't verify that they finally got tired of hearing from me on a weekly basis, and they just had to move to a different office. Whether that's true, I don't know. I think that's inter-office gossip. But the person I've been dealing with now, I said, listen, you've told me, you feel my reporting is unfair. That might be true. Let me talk to somebody and let's talk this out. I could be entirely wrong. If I'm wrong, I'll go on the air and correct it. And they finally agreed to a conversation, and we just published that article 2 weeks. And, props to Scott Rasmussen. He answered all my questions. The office did ask me to give them the questions in advance, which, Sean, as journalistically, you tend not to do something like that. But I felt, Scott was added to this program in 2019. So the project should have been done. And he was kind of brought in way after the deadline had passed. So, out of fairness to him, I have no beef with him. He's just the official in the chair at the time. So, I kind of set aside the standards of journalism for a moment to give them those questions because I thought it was the fair thing to do.
I have to say, I have mixed feelings about this story because I'm very glad you're out there tracking this down and making them accountable. At the same time, New York really has done more than many other states. And at the same other time, I really hate that they allowed satellite to get any kind of money because I just feel like that was probably a political decision at the time just to avoid saying we're not doing anything for those people because we're not creative enough to come up with a solution or bold enough to do something that would really be, a precedent setting to actually get them a real solution. And so I'm really glad that you're out there. I wish, even here in Minnesota, where I think our program works really well, I wish we had someone who was really digging into it and asking those hard questions.
It's interesting because the program did do quite a bit for some areas, and I'm not a statewide reporter. I mean, I only report on the things that are impacting the community I serve. And while it's a large community, it is a large section of the state. And unfortunately, the program didn't have the impact like it claimed it did in our region. A good example was when the governor was announcing the phase 2 awards, or was announcing the initial awards. He said, Erie County is going to be prioritized in the first year, and we're going to get you guys connected up 100%, by the end of 2018. And we actually were on the bottom percentile of the dollars allocated for this program in total. And I've tried to ask, I asked Scott that directly, and he couldn't speak for the governor because that happened way before he even joined, the program. So, he provided a fair answer to that. I mean, there is some things on the record from the governor. The Charter Time Warner merger did play a big impact into the New York State broadband program. And that's been a separate fight, me trying to get data on that issue as well. But at the end of the day, that merger really impacted Western New York's standing within that program, because promises were made to Western New York by charter, I believe, to the state, and we don't necessarily know if there was any follow through on those promises.
Do you feel that like reporting on charter in New York is almost like reporting on the mob? I feel like, I mean, if charter to me seems more powerful than the state. The elected officials feel comfortable criticizing them and threatening them up to a point. But as far as I can tell, there's not a single person in power that takes seriously that New York would do anything to hurt charter, no matter what charter does to New York.
I think a perfect example of just the complexity of the charter standing within the state is this new $15 bill mandate, and how it's going to impact other providers versus how it's going to really impact charter. There's a new provider coming to Buffalo, as I mentioned from the reporting we did, Greenlight Networks. And they're based out of Rochester right now, and they're slowly expanding towards Western New York. And they provide on paper, a pretty interesting service, $50 for 500 megs. And, whether they hit that target, even if they hit, a third of that, that's still, really good for our region. They're not $1 billion company, right? They're a smaller, well-funded, but albeit smaller, provider. They only provide one service, 500 for $50, versus a Spectrum, which has many tiers, can offer a variety of things. In my conversations with folks there, I mean, they're very concerned about this mandate. They think it's the right thing to do, but it's set up. It's going to impact the smaller players versus, the Verizons, the AT&Ts, and the charters. And, when the governor singled out charter in a recent speech saying, they don't have the God-given right to operate in New York State. Well, we saw how that played out before, with the Time Warner merger, and, promises were made. And I've been trying to get the plan of record for that expansion charter promise was going to happen. They've been filing with the Public Service Commission to each quarter as a requirement of that merger, saying we've done 12,000 passings this quarter or 15,000. We're so close to the goal. But always followed up with that filing is a confidentiality. We don't know where they're actually connecting. And part of my investigating has been, what are you doing in Erie County, Western New York? Because we were supposed to get broadband funding. We didn't, because you said you were going to connect us, and I don't see any evidence of you actually doing that. I'll stop short of saying it's like reporting on the mob. I do have a decent relationship with some of their folks over there in terms of a typical reporter PIO type relationship where they usually answer my questions. It's pretty much the boilerplate statements, but they tell me things I do need to know about the scene. But it is it's a complicated relationship between charter and, I think, the governor. I mean, one of the governor's special advisors is now had one of the top people in the government affairs department at charter. So, I mean, clearly conversations are easily had between charter and the governor's office.
Yep. And let me, I'm going to show my bias here, coming from a print journalism background, but, my experience as a consumer of, or a viewer of local television news, and I think this speaks well to WGRZ's commitment to covering this topic, is my experience as a viewer is fire, car accident, some violent incident. If we can't find one locally, we'll go to one of our affiliates in New Hampshire or Florida or something like that. Sports, weather, and then, a cute, warm, fuzzy thing. Good night, rinse, wash, repeat. Not a lot of type of coverage like this. And so I'm fascinated that your coverage has been, what it has been, and that you've been given the bandwidth, pun intended, to cover this topic.
And that he's done it better than most print journalists, just to be very
Amen.
clear.
Amen.
Thank you.
Amen. But I was actually interested to hear, you obviously report in a very visual medium, and I'm wondering, is it a challenge reporting on this particular topic? With all the complexities and so many parts of this that are unfamiliar to most folks, is that a challenge in reporting on this? Or how do you, what kind of aids do you use to try to tell the story in a visually compelling way?
Well, first I'll talk about, kind of your assessment of local news. And, that is a fair criticism across the nation of local news, right? And just like print journalism, stations are getting gutted left and right with staffing cuts. The pandemic has obviously played into complexities. And, Western New York in particular, we get a lot of snow in the winter months. And, sometimes we go all in on a snowstorm. And I think fairly people can criticize that. But I also will answer, our ratings are never higher when it's snowing. People tune in for the snow. I mean, people when there's one of the most popular stories I was ever a part of was the Bethlehem Steel Fire, and it was the day after the 2016 election. So everybody's they're reacting to the 2016 election and who won that, and then the next morning, the old Bethlehem steel plant in Buffalo somehow caught on fire. That was being used for storage at the time, and they never actually determined what caused it. But I came over what's called the Skyway, and you could look down Route 5 and see what looked like a bomb had gone off in the town of Lackawanna. Just the blackest smoke I've ever seen in my life, and flames shooting up in the sky. And it's stories like that immediately draw a whole community in. Unfortunately, that being said, I'll tip my hat to not only my station but several stations in our market put in a lot of resources for investigative journalism. And we partner with a nonprofit called Investigative Post, who works with us as well. But the other stations, I'll give them credit too. They do a lot of good investigative work. Another station did a lot of the work on the Catholic Church scandal, sex scandal several years ago. We did as well. We were all kind of on top of that. But we invest a lot into investigative journalism. So, to answer your second question, it is hard. It's very hard to make broadband visually interesting, right? And, I try to rely a lot on graphics and explaining the data in graphic form. I've gone to pretty much every corner of my viewing area to get signs that I see on the side of the road, internet, new internet, $99, and I've called those numbers before, and it's just satellite. They're always in rural countries, and I'm sure Minnesota has them and other markets have them too. You go out into the sticks and you'll see a sign tacked to a telephone pole, and that's when you're in an area that does not have really any internet access. So it's certainly a challenge. I'm fortunate I've been doing this long enough. I started editing video when I was in high school. My high school had a TV station, and we, produced basketball games and football games. We had a morning show that was probably the worst thing in the world, but at the time it was the coolest. So I got a leg up in doing all of that, and I've just kind of honed my skills to be able to quickly create graphics looks for, this story. And I, to save those templates to be able to just quickly churn out graphics. And you just have to find a creative way to tell that story. And, we try our best. I've got a lot of video of just wires and, cell towers and, little hubs that I know have internet on them. So, but it's absolutely a challenge. But I think people have responded to it locally, because a lot of people have said it didn't feel like a boring data story. So thank you. Those have been some of the comments that, because investigative journalism, and this story is not necessarily investigative. It's just, digging in deeper to a degree. But any investigative story, can be hard to sell on TV because it can sometimes be very in the weeds. And obviously broadband is very much in the weeds.
Have you found that those stories are more popular than the story that they might be replaced by if they weren't around that day?
And that's hard to tell, unless I pitch it. If they don't go with the pitch I've done that day, I might get assigned to what we call a Celebrate Western New York story, to what Sean was saying, what's the feel-good story of the day. And you got to have a mix. And, there is certainly enough happening, I think, statewide, and especially in our region, where I could probably produce 1 or 2 stories a week. And it does get oversaturated, and I recognize that. And, I make the joke every single time I pitch it. It's like, I got another broadband story, and we don't need to do it today, but I'm going to need to tell it soon. It can be challenging, but they've been popular because they've been getting results, especially those first few stories we did where it led to actual policy change. They were the most popular stories of the day at the time. And fairly regularly when there's news, when the governor was in town to officially sign the $15 bill, I mean, I was working nightside that night, but I came in early to assist the team with that coverage and kind of coach them up on, what this actually meant. And they actually my own station interviewed me for the story. I didn't tell the story, so it was kind of a unique experience because I've kind of become that expert, right? And again, I'm not necessarily, I have no industry experience. I've just read a lot of documents and, followed websites like yours to, keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening.
I'd like to actually go back to one thing in particular that you recently reported about this audit that the state comptroller's office is conducting of the broadband program in New York. I think your reporting said it should be released soon, and so I'm curious to know well, first of all, do you know when that will be released, and do you have, what do you expect it will reveal?
unbeknownst to me, when I first reported on that, I believe it was October, November, the audit actually started after some of our initial reporting last February. They started the audit in March, which, audits are never really a news item, unless a controller really wants to. Everything's political, right? So usually the controllers and the governors are usually butting heads, even if they're both Democrats. There was no initial release on this. So, when I kind of caught wind of it, because I just happened to randomly ask, I'm like, by chance, you guys auditing the program? Oh yeah, we've been auditing it since March. I'm like, oh, well, great. They said it would be done soon at that point. And that was back in October, November. And I've followed up every month. And, basically at this point, I'm like, hey, it's me. Question mark? Like, do you have anything for me yet? And I get it. Audits are complex, and obviously with the pandemic, it's a lot harder. And also, audits require cooperation. And I'm not necessarily alluding to nobody's not cooperating, but we're past a year now where that audit has started, and I'm very curious when we'll get that. As for what we expect that's going to say. It's hard to say that, they're looking at the dollars committed and the dollars, spent and what the results were. And I don't think it's going to be too surprising if you've seen some of the reporting we've done, what's going to come out from that audit. There wasn't the dollar for dollar match that was promised. And in some instances, they weren't even close. I can understand, some are, a little close, but when we're talking, sometimes the state would put in tens of millions and the private match was only 1 or 2. I think it's just going to break down that a lot more. And in terms of the timing of when it'll be put out, like I said, everything's political. November's coming up. People want to get reelected. Who knows? I'm anticipating it soon. But I know the office knows I want it. They said they'll get it to me as soon as they have it available. Because again, and I'm not patting myself on the back, but I've been looking at this closely. I don't think anyone besides me, at least in New York State, is actually interested in the audit.
So they're not.
I don't even know if the controller's office is, really looking forward to it. I don't know, but it's going to be interesting what that breakdown is, because it's probably not going to be too surprising, just based on what I've been looking at for now over almost 2 years. But perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps there's some gross misconduct. And that's just going to keep the story going. I mean, whenever government's in any project, right? I mean, there's the potential where everything was promised and not delivered. I mean, the big thing for our viewing area is the Armstrong Communications Project in the Southern Tier. And the one thing I've been digging into is they applied for RDOF money. And I looked at the census blocks that they applied for RDOF, and there are hundreds of census blocks that they were awarded funds from the state program that they've now done RDOF funding for. And I can't get them to answer my question as to why. It could be completely justified, completely reasonable. And that's, again, I'm not an industry expert. But at least on the surface, you're asking for money for funding for census blocks you should have already completed.
Right.
And to me, that there's smoke in that hay bale fire.
So you expect this audit to be mostly sort of a financial audit, not so much a data audit? Because I know one of the things that you've reported frequently is about this claim that the governor continues to make about this 98% coverage, which is likely to be not true, but
I don't anticipate it being a data audit. I could be completely surprised, and maybe that is part of their investigation. They have not. They've told me some things, and a lot of the things they've told me kind of line up to the things I've already reported. If they were to do an audit like that, that would be very surprising and very newsworthy. Mainly because there's Senator Sean Ryan, who's a Western New York legislator, just got through a bill passed through the budget and through the Assembly and Legislature to have the PSC do a complete audit, so to speak, on its own of broadband availability. I've dubbed it the Broadband Study Bill, and it was initially pocket vetoed by the governor because at the time he said it was an unfunded mandate and they wouldn't be able to fund it. It was $3 million at the time, and if anyone knows anything like New York State, we do that all the time, as does California. That's pretty much how those states operate, with just money coming from anywhere. But so that was very surprising. But that bill has now come through, and the PSC is supposed to start that audit of broadband accessibility within the next month or so. So I doubt the controller's office has done that, but if they did, that's going to be that'll be the story.
Have there been often times where you were like in the middle of a story and you were like, oh, this is interesting, but man, the audience is just not going to go for this? Yeah,
I mean, quite a bit. The things people tend to latch onto the most was the way the data is collected for broadband mapping. And, it's well documented, the way the FCC...
Wait, you're breaking news here. If there's data being collected for broadband mapping, I'd like to know about it, because from what I can see, it's mostly invented along the way, not collected. Sorry.
And the most surprising thing to me has been just how evident that is, right? And just how I'm working on a story, because Western New York has some tribal, land on it. The Seneca Nation takes up some significant parts of our viewing area. And, I'm working on a story right now where somebody lives on the line of the Seneca Nation. His next door neighbor has spectrum. There's other houses on the Seneca Nation down the road that, are just dense, as dense as the neighbors who have it. And it's a clear digital redlining story, right? They don't want to go into tribal lands. Okay, they made that decision, but again, you're looking at, why? Like you're passing up a couple thousand customers. I don't know why. And, of course, getting answers is always challenging, but there's a lot of in the weeds stuff with this. And, my editors and news director often, they're taking the axe to my stories. They're like, that's great, but, there's no time for that. The most recent example was my state broadband story. It had a whole minute and a half section about satellite. And at the end of the day, we couldn't have a 7-minute story on the Friday night news, right? I mean, like, I'm a reasonable reporter. I'm not going to, have a monopoly on the whole half hour, but so we decided, okay, that's going to be its own breakout story, because it's important, but it's not the important story at the time was we got this interview we've been asking for a year, so we'll get into the satellite thing because that is a complicated topic that you need to set up, you need to explain and go on from there. But, the one story people have really latched onto is when I explain, what data is available and who is providing it and why. And that has led to several people saying, I've typed in my address on, this provider's website and they said they can provide it, but then I call them and they said, oh, they can't, and when you just look at examples of that, they'll run a line for $20,000 or $50,000 or even $75,000 to run 800 feet of cable. It's frustrating because you don't have an answer for them. You just get the same boilerplate statements from whatever provider you're asking about. Digging into those types of stories has led to some change. For example, in the town of Boston, which is just south of Buffalo, there was a whole neighborhood that was promised, Spectrum cable, never delivered. I asked around, oh, well, we're going to be connecting that by the end of the year. But the person was told in writing, we're not connecting the street.
Mm-hmm.
So it took our phone call to get that progress made. So it wasn't widespread, but it was a win for that street. And I've often said, okay, well, if I have to do a story about every street in Western New York, I'll do it if I have to, just to get them connected. So,
Sean, we're about out of time. Did you have a final question that you wanted to ask and answer quickly?
Well, not really. Yeah. You know what? One last thing. Any have you gotten any pushback on the reporting that you've gotten? I don't necessarily mean internally, but just in the community or from, maybe some of the big providers or
anyone
anything
burn
like
your
that?
house down?
Right. Yeah. Yes, I have gotten pushback from the state, from the providers, rightfully so. Right. I mean, anytime.
All in the course of business.
Exactly. And, they've gone a long time without anybody, not even looking under a microscope, but just asking questions. Right. I mean, local news on a whole tend to only talk about internet when, a bunch of people get a letter saying your bill's going up. And then you have the day turn story of the bills are going up and everybody's mad. And then it's forgotten about, right? Nobody on a local level really has dug into it, and that's where I found the opportunity. Okay, nobody's talking about this, but it's a problem that within the industry people know about, but nobody's talking about it. Somebody should be, I guess I'll do it. In the pushback, it really hasn't been anything. It's usually just public information officers or, public relations people going, that wasn't fair. You didn't talk to Verizon or AT&T. You only talked to me, or, the typical type of stuff. And, sometimes it's warranted. Sometimes, I can't prevent, I can't help who calls me back and who doesn't. Right. But I still have to turn a story. I mean, that's the one thing about local news is, we got to turn stuff on a daily basis. And sometimes I wish I had the print journalism job where I can maybe dig in a little bit more. But print journalists too, still have to turn stuff on a daily basis. It's just our stories, require graphics, video, interview, all that kind of stuff. So it just takes longer. And I've kind of, the one thing during the pandemic I've loved is people have been more accessible because of Zoom, FaceTime, Skype, whatever. And I've been able to churn out a lot more quickly, and people have been made available to be able to tell these stories. So, we're going to keep digging into it. We're going to try to get answers. Obviously, there's still questions that remain with the state program. There's a huge multi-million-dollar project in our area that still isn't complete. We want answers on that. And, basically it boils down to, from what I gather so far, is it's your typical, smaller ISP dealing with utility companies for access, and talk about a story that's in the weeds. Why would somebody who has, maybe FiOS at their house or high speed at their house in the suburbs care about a utility dispute in, Alma, New York, that has a population of 400 people? Well, they probably don't. So we have to find a creative way to tell that story. And that's the exciting and challenging part about this type of reporting for local news.
Thank you so much, Nate. It's been fun talking about this from a different perspective. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Nate. Right on. WRITE.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you so much for the work you guys do, and just highlighting a lot of issues that are not only happening in New York but elsewhere too.
That was Christopher and Sean talking with Nate Benson. We have transcripts for this and other podcasts available at muninetworks.org/broadbandbits. Email us at podcast@muninetworks.org with your ideas for the show. Follow Chris on Twitter. His handle's @CommunityNets. Follow muninetworks.org stories on Twitter. The handle's @muninetworks. Subscribe to this and other podcasts from ILSR, including Building Local Power, Local Energy Rules, and the Composting for Community podcast. You can access them anywhere you get your podcasts. You can catch the latest important research from all of our initiatives if you subscribe to our monthly newsletter at ilsr.org. While you're there, please take a moment to donate. Your support in any amount keeps us going. Thank you to Arnie Hughesby for the song Warm Duck Shuffle, licensed through Creative Commons. This was episode 460 of the Community Broadband Bits podcast. Thanks for listening.